There is a First Nations community in northern Ontario where none of the more than 500 homes have running water. Not a temporary outage, not a boil water advisory, no running water at all in any home. The chief of that community, Patty Peters, said his wife died of cancer without ever seeing running water in their house. She went outside to the outhouse when she was sick. This is Canada in 2024. Canada is supposed to be the polite one. Universal healthcare, the Charter of Rights, the world's longest coastline, Tim Hortons on every corner. But what doesn't make the tourism campaign is the other Canada, the one where a whole generation of Indigenous children grew up unable to drink the water from their own taps, the one where post-industrial towns are selling houses for the price of a used truck. The one where the federal government made promises about clean water in 2015, and as of 2025, dozens of communities are still waiting. These places are real. They are documented by the CBC, Human Rights Watch, and the government's own Auditor General, and they are in a country that calls itself the lucky one. And trust me, you are not ready for what's sitting at number one. Let's break it down. Thompson is a city of around 12,000 people in northern Manitoba, about 740 kilometers north of Winnipeg. It was built as a company town in the late 1950s, specifically to house workers for the International Nickel Company, INCO, which operated one of the largest nickel mining and smelting operations in Canada. For decades, Thompson was the economic anchor of northern Manitoba, providing stable employment and a functioning urban center in a part of the province that would otherwise have minimal infrastructure. Then the nickel market changed. Vale, which acquired INCO in 2006, progressively scaled back operations. Job cuts followed, families left, the population declined from a peak of over 14,000, and the housing market followed the population data with grim precision. Home prices in Thompson have fallen approximately 25% since 2018, according to documented analyses of the Canadian housing market. The rental market has a vacancy rate that climbed above 20%, meaning 1 in 5 rental units is sitting empty. Some homeowners have simply walked away from their mortgages, leaving properties abandoned. The challenge for Thompson is geographic. Its remote northern location makes it genuinely difficult to attract new industries or employers to replace what Vale's reductions removed. The services that exist, hospitals, schools, government offices, are scaled for the larger population that used to live there, and maintaining them for a shrinking tax base is a fiscal challenge the city is navigating in real time. The highway to Winnipeg is the only road connection, and in a province where winters regularly hit -40, that road matters in ways that people further south don't fully appreciate. Thompson is not yet in crisis in the way that some communities on this list are, but the trajectory is clearly documented. The housing data is real, and the structural dependence on a single industry that has partially withdrawn is the template for post-industrial decline that appears across this list in various forms. Thompson's decline is economic and slow-moving. The next entry's decline was faster, more dramatic, and left behind a very specific kind of ghost. Tumbler Ridge is a small municipality in northeastern British Columbia, built from scratch in the early 1980s specifically to house workers for the new Quintet and Bull Moose coal mines. It was a planned community. The roads were laid, the houses were built, the schools were opened, all in anticipation of a coal economy that was expected to sustain the region for generations. The population grew to about 4,500 people at its peak, and then, in 2000, both mines closed. The population collapsed to under 2,000. Houses that had been worth reasonable money sold for almost nothing. Tumbler Ridge experienced one of the most rapid examples of single industry town collapse in BC history. The second act was a coal revival. New investment reopened mining operations in the mid-2000s. The population recovered somewhat, and Tumbler Ridge stabilized. Then the coal market softened again in the 2010s, and the town faced a second round of economic pressure. The documented reality of Tumbler Ridge is a community that has been through 2 full cycles of boom and bust in less than 40 years. Built for an industry, abandoned by it, partially revived, and partially abandoned again. What makes Tumbler Ridge particularly notable for this list is the housing data. During the bust periods, homes in Tumbler Ridge have sold at prices that would be astonishing anywhere in southern British Columbia. with properties listed and transacted in the $30,000 to $50,000 range during the worst years. Protests driven entirely by a market in which the population that would buy homes had partially relocated to find work elsewhere. When there are more houses than buyers, the price goes wherever the buyers are willing to go, which in a remote resource town with an uncertain economic future is not very far up. Tumbler Ridge's coal boom bust cycle is a BC story. The next entry is an Ontario story that played out over a much longer timeline with a much more creative attempted rescue. Elliot Lake is a city of around 10,000 people in northern Ontario, about 140 kilometers west of Sudbury. It was built in the 1950s as a uranium mining center. At its peak, Elliot Lake was the uranium capital of the world, producing fuel for nuclear power plants, and during the Cold War, material for American nuclear weapons programs under contracts with the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. The city grew to over 25,000 people. Then the uranium contracts ended, the mines closed in stages through the 90s, and Elliot Lake faced the collapse that every single industry town dreads. Elliot Lake's response was unusual enough to become a case study in Canadian regional economic policy. The city deliberately repositioned itself as a retirement destination. Affordable housing, clean air, access to Lake Huron, lower cost of living than Southern Ontario, and a community of services scaled for an older population. It worked, partially. A nonprofit called Retirement Living acquired significant amounts of the housing stock and operates it as affordable seniors housing. The population stabilized, though far below its peak. The housing prices that Elliot Lake's repositioning as a retirement town produced are genuinely remarkable. Properties in Elliot Lake have sold for prices that would be unimaginable in the Greater Toronto area. Homes in the $40,000 to $70,000 range, sometimes lower for properties needing work. For retirees or remote workers willing to trade urban amenity for dramatically lower cost of living, Elliot Lake offers a real proposition. But it is a proposition shaped entirely by the economic collapse that preceded the repositioning and the infrastructure of a city built for 25,000 people now maintained for 10,000. A 2012 roof collapse at the Algo Center Mall, which killed 2 people, brought national attention to the infrastructure challenges of a city managing aging buildings on a reduced tax base. That event accelerated discussions about the long-term sustainability of Elliot Lake's infrastructure and the challenge of maintaining a city physically designed for a much larger population. Elliot Lake reinvented itself as a retirement destination after uranium left. The next entry had no reinvention plan, just a slow, documented decline that's still ongoing. Glace Bay is a community of around 16,000 people in Cape Breton Regional Municipality in Nova Scotia. It was one of the most significant coal mining communities in Canada. The Dominion Coal Company operated mines in and around Glace Bay for over a century, and the town grew up entirely around that industry. The coal industry also produced one of the most militant labor movements in Canadian history. The Cape Breton miners were at the forefront of labor organizing in the early 20th century and the strikes and confrontations of the 1920s, including the Waterford Lake Massacre of 1925, where provincial police killed a striking miner named William Davis, are deeply embedded in Cape Breton's cultural identity. The coal mines closed progressively through the latter half of the 20th century, with the last significant operations ending in the 1990s. Cape Breton's economy contracted sharply. The population of Cape Breton Island has been declining for decades. Glace Bay, as one of the island's more working-class coal communities, absorbed the impact without the tourism infrastructure or university presence that partially cushioned Sydney, the larger regional center. Housing prices in Cape Breton have historically been among the lowest in Canada. Cape Breton's average home price has been documented by the Canadian Real Estate Association at approximately $186,000. Well below the national average. But within that average, Glace Bay and the surrounding industrial communities sit at the lower end. Properties in Glace Bay have been available for prices well under $100,000, and the most distressed properties have sold for figures that would be laughable in any major Canadian city. Cape Breton has been experiencing a modest influx of people from more expensive parts of Canada in recent years, attracted by low housing costs, a slower pace of life, and the genuinely beautiful landscape of the island. Whether that inflow is large enough and sustained enough to reverse decades of population and economic decline is an open question that Cape Breton's communities are living through in real time. Cape Breton's coal legacy is deep, and its economic recovery is partial. The next entry is about a province where the recovery never really started. Tracadie is an Acadian community of around 16,500 residents in northeastern New Brunswick on the Gulf of St. Lawrence coast. Northern New Brunswick is one of the most consistently economically distressed regions in Canada. The Canadian Mortgage and Professional Association has documented average home prices in northern New Brunswick at approximately $163,000, among the lowest in the country. In communities like Tracadie, the properties at the lower end of the market go for prices that the video's title describes. New Brunswick as a province has the lowest average home prices in Canada at around $265,000 to $291,000 as a provincial average. Northern New Brunswick sits significantly below even that low provincial average. The region's economy is built on forestry, fishing, and public sector employment, and it has faced consistent outmigration as younger people leave for larger urban centers in Quebec, Ontario, or Alberta. The living conditions that make Northern New Brunswick relevant to this list are not the dramatic crises visible in some of the Indigenous communities covered later. They are the quieter, cumulative challenges of sustained regional economic underdevelopment, healthcare access that requires long drives to larger centers, limited employment diversity, schools that lose students as families relocate, and an aging demographic profile as younger cohorts depart. The 2019 Parliamentary Committee report on rural poverty in Canada specifically cited communities like those in northern New Brunswick as examples of persistent structural disadvantage that are not captured by national averages. The Acadian cultural identity of communities like Tracadie is genuine, rich, and worth naming in the same breath as the economic data, because the people who live here are not simply the sum of their disadvantage, but the economic data is real, and it tells a story about a region that has been structurally underfunded and underinvested relative to its southern counterparts within the same province and country. Northern New Brunswick is affordable because it has been economically left behind. The next entry is a province where the entire economic story is more complicated. Bathurst is a city of about 12,000 people on Chaleur Bay in northern New Brunswick. It was, for much of the 20th century, home to the Brunswick Mine, one of the largest zinc-lead copper mines in the world, operated by Noranda Inc. At its peak, the mine employed thousands of workers and sustained the regional economy. In 2013, after decades of production, Brunswick Mine closed. Bathurst lost its economic anchor. The closure of Brunswick Mine accelerated trends that had already been building in the region: population decline, youth outmigration, a commercial sector shrinking to match the reduced demand. Home prices in Bathurst reflect the economic situation directly. Properties in Bathurst have been listed and sold at prices well below the already low New Brunswick provincial average. For buyers with cash and tolerance for the economic situation, Bathurst offers housing at prices that would be impossible anywhere in central or western Canada. Healthcare access is a particular concern in northern New Brunswick. The Vitalite Health Network serves the francophone population of the region, but specialist care, surgical capacity, and certain acute care services require travel to larger centers. For a city that has lost a significant portion of its working-age population over the past decade, the maintenance of adequate healthcare services for an older remaining population is a genuine fiscal and logistical challenge. Bathurst also has the cultural and geographical assets that much of Atlantic Canada shares: bilingual community, beautiful coastal setting on Chaleur Bay, proximity to the Restigouche River for outdoor recreation. These are real assets. They do not, however, change the economic data, and the economic data places Bathurst in the company of communities on this list. Bathurst lost its mine and is still absorbing the impact. Number 14 is a city where the impact arrived much earlier and has been absorbed for much longer. Sydney is the urban center of Cape Breton Regional Municipality. With a population of around 30,000 people, it was, for most of the 20th century, home to the Sydney Steel Corporation, Cisco, and the associated coke ovens that processed coal into coke for steel production. For over 100 years, those operations deposited industrial waste into what became known as the Sydney Tar Ponds, a contaminated site covering approximately 60 hectares of the Sydney Harbour estuary that was, at on E Point, classified as the largest industrial contamination site in Canada. The tar ponds contained an estimated 700,000 tons of contaminated sediment, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, and other toxic compounds. Residents of the surrounding Whitney Pier and Ashby neighborhoods, predominantly working class and in many cases black Nova Scotian communities with deep historical roots in the steel industry, lived adjacent to that contamination for generations. Studies documented elevated rates of certain cancers and health conditions in the affected communities. The cleanup, which began in earnest in the mid-2000s under a federal-provincial agreement, cost approximately $400 million and was largely completed by around 2013. What the cleanup produced was a remediated site, now called Open Hearth Park, built on top of the former contamination. The industrial land that surrounded it remained underdeveloped. Sydney's economic situation reflects the loss of the steel industry and the decades-long impact of industrial contamination on community health, investment, and property values. Housing in Sydney is among the most affordable in Nova Scotia, with properties at the lower end of the market available for prices well below national averages. Sydney carries the legacy of Canada's largest industrial contamination site. The next entry carries something different, a housing crisis that the CBC described in terms no Canadian should be comfortable with. Attawapiskat First Nation is a Cree community of approximately 2,000 registered members, located about 500 kilometers north of Timmins, Ontario, on the shore of James Bay. It is accessible only by plane or winter ice road. In 2011, Chief Teresa Spence declared a housing emergency, and the images that emerged from Attawapiskat, families living in uninsulated sheds, wood-frame tents heated by wood stoves, donated construction trailers with no water hookup and no electricity, circulated nationally and generated a brief, intense period of public attention. The immediate trigger was a broken sewage system that had rendered dozens of homes uninhabitable, combined with chronic housing shortage that had existed for years before the sewage failure. Newborn babies were in the sheds. There were no water connections to the structures people were living in Northern Ontario. In November, this was not theoretical third world conditions. It was documented, photographed, and reported by the CBC, and the federal government's response, sending an external auditor rather than emergency housing, generated its own significant controversy. Attawapiskat's housing crisis of 2011 was not an anomaly. It was the visible peak of a chronic infrastructure deficit that has characterized many remote First Nations communities in Northern Ontario for decades. The 2012 Federal Auditor General's report found that the federal government had spent over $90 million on Attawapiskat over a 6-year period, but also found significant problems with the accountability and effectiveness of that spending, and noted that the housing and infrastructure needs of the community remain severe. As of 2025, Attawapiskat continues to face infrastructure challenges. The community has also been the site of a mental health and suicide crisis. In 2016, after a series of suicide attempts among young people in the community, Attawapiskat's chief declared another state of emergency, this time a mental health emergency. That declaration and the community's suffering received significant media attention. The structural conditions that drove it have been more resistant to resolution than the attention cycle that surrounded it. Attawapiskat's housing crisis made national headlines in 2011. The conditions that caused it predated those headlines by decades. The next entry's water crisis predates its headlines by even longer. Neskantaga First Nation is a remote OG Cree community of approximately 400 registered members located 436 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay, accessible only by plane or winter ice road. In February 1995, the community's water treatment plant, built in 91, funded by what was then the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, was placed on a boil water advisory. That advisory has never been lifted. As of 2025, Neskantaga has been under a boil water advisory for 30 years. A whole generation of children in Neskantaga grew up unable to drink the water from their taps. That is not a rhetorical device. It is a documented, verifiable, literal fact about a community in Northern Ontario, Canada in the 21st century. The water system built for the community in 1991 did not work adequately from the beginning. The federal government has been aware of the problem and has invested money in addressing it across multiple attempts. The advisory has persisted through liberal and conservative federal governments alike. Canadian Geographic's 2025 reporting on Neskantaga found that as of early 2025, there were still 32 long-term drinking water advisories on First Nations reserves across Canada. A long-term advisory is defined as one that has been in place for more than a year. Some of those advisories, including Neskantaga's, have been in place for decades. The federal government's 2015 election promised to eliminate all long-term water advisories on reserves by March 2021 was not met. The proposed First Nations Clean Water Act, introduced in 2023, was still incomplete as of the time of reporting due to parliamentary prorogation. Indigenous Services Canada reported that the federal government invested over $5.6 billion since 2016 to support water and wastewater infrastructure on reserves. The 2021 Auditor General's report found that despite that investment, Ottawa did not provide the support necessary to ensure that First Nations have ongoing access to safe drinking water. $5 billion in 30 years. One community, one boil water advisory, still active. Neskantaga has been boiling its water for 30 years. The next entry has been doing something even more basic, hauling water by bucket from a lake, because running water doesn't reach the houses at all. Pikangikum. First Nation is a remote Ojibwe community of approximately 4,000 people, more than 500 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay, Ontario. It is the entry that the intro to this video was built around. And the reason for that is straightforward. None of the more than 500 homes in Pikangikum have access to running water. Not a boil water advisory, not contaminated water, no running water. The community's water treatment plant services only the school, the nursing station, the band office, and a handful of government buildings. Everything else gets water from a single functioning access point in the community, or collects it from the lake in buckets. Chief Patty Peters, who has led Pikangikum for most of his adult life, told CBC News in 2024 that his wife died of cancer without ever seeing running water in their house. She had to go outside to the outhouse when she was sick. Peters, who turned 69 years old, has been dealing with the same infrastructure challenges his community faced when he first took office at age 30. In 2024, Pikangikum announced it was taking the government of Canada to federal court, seeking $2 billion in damages and $200 million in emergency relief for urgent repairs to the water treatment plant. The health consequences of the water situation are documented by the community's own health authority. Waterborne related illnesses, particularly eczema and skin infections from inadequate water for bathing, are a regular feature of the nursing station's caseload. When Walkerton, Ontario had an E. coli outbreak in 2000 that killed 7 people, the government responded with immediate resources and a sustained inquiry. When Pikangikum had an E. coli outbreak the same year that resulted in a woman needing her arms and legs amputated, Chief Peters said the government did not respond with equivalent urgency. The Pikangikum Road, accessible only by winter ice road or by plane, becomes impassable when the ice isn't safe, meaning the community is periodically accessible only by air. Buying bulk water cases means flying to Red Lake, 100 kilometers south. The Northern Store, the community's primary retail outlet, sells bottled water at prices that reflect the cost of flying everything into a remote community. To access clean water on your own land in Canada in 2024 in a community of 4,000 people, you fly to get it. Pikangikum has 4,000 people and no running water in any home. The next entry has running water, but for 20 years their children couldn't drink it. Shoal Lake 40, First Nation, sits on the Ontario-Manitoba border with approximately 632 registered members, of whom 289 live on the reserve. In the early 1900s, the city of Winnipeg needed a water supply. The solution chosen was to pipe water from Shoal Lake, the lake adjacent to the Shoal Lake 40 Reserve, to Winnipeg, 150 kilometers away. To build that pipeline, the city of Winnipeg expropriated a strip of land from the Shoal Lake 40 Reserve and, in constructing the associated infrastructure, cut the community off from the mainland and effectively created a man-made island. Shoal Lake 40 has been on a boil water advisory since 1997. For nearly 30 years, the community whose lake supplies Winnipeg's drinking water has not been able to drink its own water. Winnipeg residents have drunk clean water from Shoal Lake for over 100 years. The people of Shoal Lake 40 have been trucking in bottled water and living under a boil water advisory for nearly 30 of those years. As the disparity is not subtle, Human Rights Watch documented it in their 2016 report on the First Nations water crisis. The community was on the front page of national newspapers. The term Boil Water Boulevard entered the Canadian discourse. In 2019, after decades of advocacy and a federal commitment of funding, construction began on Freedom Road, a permanent all-season road connecting Shoal Lake 40 to the mainland highway network, ending the community's island isolation. The road was completed in 2019. The Boil Water Advisory, however, was still in place as of the most recent available reporting, though work on the community's water infrastructure has been underway. The Freedom Road was an important infrastructure improvement. It did not, by itself, fix the water system. The Shoal Lake 40 situation is one of the most symbolically clear examples on this entire list of the structural inequity at the heart of Canada's relationship with its First Nations. A city of over 700,000 people drinks clean water from a lake. 2 kilometers away, the people who live on that lake boil their water before they drink it. Both of these things are true simultaneously. They have been true simultaneously for nearly 30 years. Shoal Lake 40 is cut off from the mainland it supplies water to. The next entry was never connected to the mainland in any meaningful sense at all. Wasagamack First Nation is a remote community in northern Manitoba, accessible by winter road or float plane. A CBC investigation documented that the majority of residents in Wasagamack have no indoor plumbing. They rely on outhouses, slop pails, and frequent trips to a communal water station for basic sanitation. The phrase slop pails in a CBC headline from Canada in the 21st century is not satire. It is a description of the actual sanitation infrastructure available to Canadian citizens in a documented community. Wasagamack is part of the Island Lake First Nations, a group of 4 communities in the Loxell area of northern Manitoba that have been among the most consistently documented cases of infrastructure deficit in Canada. The Island Lake communities have faced persistent challenges with housing overcrowding, water access, and sanitation that have been reported by the CBC, examined by parliamentary committees, and acknowledged by successive federal governments without the sustained investment required to resolve them. The federal regulatory gap that applies to First Nations water and sanitation infrastructure is particularly relevant to communities like Wasagamack. Off-reserve Canadians have their water and sanitation regulated by provincial governments, which set and enforce standards. On-reserve communities fall under federal jurisdiction, but the federal government has not implemented comprehensive water quality regulations equivalent to provincial standards. The result is that the same basic legal protections available to all other Canadians are not available by law to residents of First Nations reserves. That gap was precisely what Bill C-61, the proposed First Nations Clean Water Act, was designed to address. And as noted, the bill died when Parliament was prorogued in January 2025. Wasagamack relies on outhouses because indoor plumbing never arrived. The next entry has infrastructure, but it's been contaminated since before most of its residents were born. Grassy Narrows First Nation, a Sub-Piskosi-Wagong, is an Anishinaabe community of approximately 1,000 people in northwestern Ontario, about 80 kilometers from Kenora. Between 1962 and 1970, the Dryden Chemical Company, operating upstream on the English Wabigoon River system, discharged approximately 10 tons of mercury into the river. Grassy Narrows and the downstream community of Wabasimung, whose members fished the river and ate the fish as a primary food source, absorbed a mercury contamination that caused Minamata disease, a neurological condition caused by mercury poisoning. In a significant portion of the community's population, the mercury contamination and its health consequences have been documented since the 1970s. The provincial government banned commercial fishing on the English Wabigoon River in 1970. Traditional fishing, a cultural practice central to Anishinaabe identity and food security, was effectively destroyed for Grassy Narrows and Wabasimung, community members who ate contaminated fish before the ban, and for years afterward, as information was slow to reach isolated communities, developed neurological symptoms, tremors, hearing loss, vision deterioration, cognitive impairment, and birth defects in the children of affected parents. As of 2025, the mercury contamination remains in the river sediment. It does not degrade at a rate that makes the problem historical. It is an ongoing environmental reality. The Dryden Chemical Company no longer exists. The Ontario and federal government spent decades in litigation and denegotiation over responsibility for remediation and compensation. In 2017, the Ontario government committed to building a mercury care home for affected community members. In 2020, the federal and Ontario governments announced a $1 billion remediation commitment, the largest remediation funding commitment in Canadian history to address the mercury contamination, which had been documented for 60 years. Human Rights Watch's 2016 report on the First Nations water crisis included Grassy Narrows, documenting ongoing concerns about water quality in the community on top of the mercury legacy. The community has been advocating for a clear end state for the remediation, a point at which the river will be declared safe, and has not yet received a definitive timeline. Grassy Narrows has been poisoned for 60 years by upstream industry, with no one held criminally accountable. The next entry was poisoned by the government itself. Nazko First Nation is a small community in the Chilcotin region of central British Columbia, approximately 100 kilometers west of Quesnel. It became the subject of a widely cited CBC report on the First Nations water crisis that introduced many Canadians to the specific phrase used by Nazko Chief Stuart Alec. "It's very upsetting," Alec told the CBC. "We live in Canada, but on reserve it feels like third world conditions. Drinking, bathing, it's pretty appalling these conditions exist in this country." Nazko's water system had received $3.5 million in federal funding to fix its problems. The money was spent, the problems persisted. Chief Alec's assessment of why: they took the easy route. They sent money but did not put someone on the ground. They filtered out money so it would look like they were dealing with the issue, but they needed a project manager on the ground to oversee the project and report to the band and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. None of that happened. The Nazko case is instructive because it illustrates a pattern that appears across multiple First Nations water infrastructure failures. Federal money allocated, projects built or repaired to insufficient standards, advisory not lifted, community still without safe water. The CBC's 2015 investigation found that between 2004 and 2014, 93% of all First Nations in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick reported at least one water advisory in their communities. Alberta was 87%. The lowest provincial rate was 51% in Manitoba. The Council of Canadians Advocacy Group has documented the ways in which federal reporting on water advisories understates the problem. The federal count covers only communities south of the 60th parallel, does not track First Nations in all provinces, and does not track homes and buildings not connected to a public water system. Communities without running water at all, like Pikangikum, do not appear in the advisory count because you can only have a boil water advisory if you have a water system. Nazko's chief used the exact words this video's title describes. The next entry has a chief who said something similar, and a community whose conditions justify both statements. Kashechewan First Nation is a Cree community of approximately 2,000 people on the shore of James Bay in northern Ontario, about 200 kilometers north of Cochrane. It became the focus of intense national media attention in 2005 when an E. coli contamination of the community's water supply was confirmed, and approximately 1,100 community members, more than half the population, were evacuated by the federal government on medical grounds. The contamination was linked to the location of the community's water intake, which was downstream of the sewage lagoon. The 2005 evacuation produced images that many Canadians found genuinely shocking. A community in their own country, evacuated for contaminated drinking water in conditions that the federal health officials who arrived described as unacceptable. Skin rashes, gastrointestinal illness, and infections attributed to the contaminated water were documented. The government's response was to evacuate the community, improve the water system, and return residents to Kashechewan. But the underlying question of whether the community should be relocated to a safer, more sustainable location away from a floodplain that regularly threatens the community with spring floods was never definitively resolved. Kashechewan floods regularly and significantly. The community sits on the James Bay coast at an elevation that makes it vulnerable to spring flooding from the Albany River. Multiple evacuations have occurred since 2005, not just for water quality, but for actual flooding that inundates homes and forces residents to temporarily relocate. In 2019, flooding forced the evacuation of most of the community. In 2023, flooding again displaced residents. A community that floods regularly, in a climate where those floods are expected to become more severe, in a location that has no road access to the outside world, is a community facing compound challenges that no single infrastructure investment can fully address. Kashechewan evacuates for flooding and contaminated water and keeps being told to go back. The next entry was simply told to leave, and the community fought to stay. This entry is about a set of communities rather than a single town. The African Nova Scotian communities of rural Nova Scotia, which are among the oldest black communities in Canada and some of the most persistently economically marginalized communities in the country. Communities like North Preston, East Preston, Cherrybrook, Lake Loon, Cherrybrook, and Lincolnville, most of them in Halifax County, were established by black loyalists and black refugees who came to Nova Scotia after the American Revolution and the War of 1812, receiving land grants that were typically smaller, less fertile, and more remote than those given given to white settlers. The land grants given to black loyalists starting in the 1780s were often on marginal land in isolated locations without access to markets, services, or economic opportunity. Over 2 centuries, these communities developed in geographic isolation without the infrastructure investment that went to neighboring communities. Roads were poor or unpaved, services were minimal, employment opportunities were limited. The community of Lincolnville was the subject of a specific controversy when a provincial landfill was sited adjacent to it, a pattern of environmental facility placement in black communities that researchers have documented as environmental racism. North Preston, the largest African Nova Scotian community with a population of around 3,000, has faced documented challenges with infrastructure, housing quality, and economic opportunity that reflected the generational consequences of the original land grant inequality. Nova Scotia's African Nova Scotian Affairs Directorate has documented the community's needs and advocated for investment. Housing in North Preston and similar communities has historically been among the most affordable in Halifax County, a product of the same historical marginalization that produced the conditions in the first place. The African Nova Scotian communities are not in the same category of service deprivation as the remote First Nations communities described elsewhere on this list. They have road access, electricity, municipal services, but they represent the oldest continuous documentation of structural poverty and service inequality in Canadian history, rooted in deliberate decisions about land, race, and who deserved what in the British colonies that became Canada. That history has not been overcome in 240 years. The African Nova Scotian communities are 240 years old and still fighting for equal infrastructure. The next entry is about a poverty that has been documented for the same length of time. Winnipeg, Manitoba is the largest prairie city and one of the coldest major cities in the world. Its north end, specifically the neighborhoods around Selkirk Avenue and the CPR main line, has been one of Canada's most persistently documented zones of urban poverty for over a century. Immigration waves in the early 20th century created a dense, working-class community in Winnipeg's north end. The Indigenous population that has grown substantially in Winnipeg over the past 5 decades has concentrated significantly in north end neighborhoods. The result is a community of genuine cultural depth and significant documented disadvantage. Winnipeg has the largest urban Indigenous population of any Canadian city by proportion, and the North End is home to a significant share of that population. Poverty rates in North End Winnipeg run dramatically above city and national averages. Violent crime rates in certain North End neighborhoods are among the highest in Canada's urban areas. Housing quality in parts of the North End ranges from modest to genuinely substandard. Rental housing at prices that attract the most economically vulnerable tenants frequently reflects the maintenance standards that those prices support. Winnipeg's Indigenous missing and murdered women and girls crisis is inseparable from the North End's social conditions. The disappearances and deaths of Indigenous women in Winnipeg, documented in multiple public inquiries and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, intersected directly with the poverty, trauma, and inadequate social services of the North End community. The final report of the National Inquiry, released in 2019, included extensive documentation of Winnipeg's North End as a community where the conditions that made Indigenous women vulnerable were concentrated. Housing in North End Winnipeg, compared to the city's overall housing market, is cheap. Properties in the lower end of the North End market sell at prices dramatically below Winnipeg's average. This affordability is the product of the same structural conditions that make the North End one of the most disadvantaged urban communities in Canada. North End Winnipeg is urban poverty in Canada's coldest city. Number 3 is remote poverty in Canada's most remote territory. Rankin Inlet is a hamlet of approximately 3,000 people on the western shore of Hudson Bay in Nunavut, approximately 530 kilometers south of the territorial capital of Iqaluit. It is one of Nunavut's larger communities and serves as the administrative center for the Kivalliq region. It has a hospital, a school, government offices, and the infrastructure of a functioning northern community. It also has a grocery bill that would restructure your understanding of what food costs. Nunavut's food costs are documented at a level that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the perspective of Southern Canadian grocery shopping. A liter of milk in Rankin Inlet can cost $8 to $12. A bag of apples can cost $20 to $30. Basic produce, Things that cost $2 or $3 at a Toronto grocery store can cost 6 to 10 times that amount in Nunavut communities, because everything that arrives in a northern community not accessible by road arrives by sea lift once a year or by air freight year-round. The Federal Nutrition North program subsidizes some food costs, but the subsidies are insufficient to close the gap between northern and southern food prices. The housing situation in Nunavut is severe across the territory. Nunavut has a documented housing shortage of thousands of units. The territorial government has been trying to address a deficit that means overcrowded homes are the norm, rather than the exception in many communities. People living in overcrowded housing in Nunavut's climate, where temperatures regularly reach -30 to -40 Celsius, are not just economically stressed. They are navigating a genuine survival infrastructure challenge in conditions that amplify the health consequences of overcrowding. Nunavut became Canada's newest territory in 1999, established as a homeland for Inuit people. The federal government's investment in Nunavut's infrastructure has been chronically insufficient relative to the territorial government's documented needs. A territory covering 2 million square kilometers, larger than Western Europe, with 38 communities accessible only by air, managing a housing deficit in the coldest conditions in North America, with the highest food prices in the country, and a government that has been operating for less than 30 years, is confronting challenges that the national conversation about Canadian prosperity rarely adequately captures. Rankin Inlet's grocery prices and housing shortage are Nunavut-wide realities. The next entry is a community where the conditions are documented not just in price data, but in the government's own court filings. Between 2004 and 2014, 93% of all First Nations in Saskatchewan reported at least one water advisory in their communities. 93% of every First Nation in the province. That is the documented figure from the CBC's 2015 investigation, and it deserves to be stated plainly before we describe the individual communities it represents. Saskatchewan's First Nations water crisis is not concentrated in one community that can be studied and addressed as a discrete problem. It is distributed across dozens of communities. Communities like Onion Lake Cree Nation, Thunderchild First Nation, Attawapiskat Nation, and others that have appeared on the federal drinking water advisory list at various points over the past 2 decades. The scale of the problem in Saskatchewan reflects the scale of the federal government's chronic underfunding of water infrastructure on reserves in a province where the reserve land base is large. The communities are often remote, and the infrastructure built in earlier decades has aged without adequate investment in maintenance and replacement. The pattern of water advisory, federal funding commitment, inadequate project management, continued advisory, additional funding, continued advisory, described by Nazko Chief Stuart Alec in relation to his BC community, appears repeatedly in the Saskatchewan record. The Council of Canadians' analysis of federal reporting has documented that the advisory count published by the federal government understates the true number of at-risk communities because it excludes communities north of 60, communities not connected to a public system, and communities in some provinces. Saskatchewan's true water infrastructure challenge is almost certainly larger than the official advisory count suggests. The specific communities most severely affected within Saskatchewan, where people have been on water advisories for years or decades, are communities with deep cultural and historical roots, with elders who remember the land before the reserves were established, with children who have grown up knowing only the restricted water reality of their community. These are not abstractions, they are families living in a country with 18% of the world's fresh surface water, unable to drink the water from their taps. Saskatchewan has the worst First Nations water record of any Canadian province. Number 1 is the community whose legal action may finally force the reckoning that decades of documentation have not. We opened this video with Pikangikum. We return to it at number 1 not because it is the only community on this list deserving of that position. Neskantaga's 30-year boil water advisory. Grassy Narrow's 60-year mercury contamination. Shoal Lake 40's island isolation. Kashechewan's repeated evacuations. All of them make credible claims to the top of any list of Canadian communities failed by their government. Pikangikum is number 1 because its 2024 federal court action against the government of Canada, seeking $2 billion in damages and $200 million in emergency relief, represents the clearest, most legally specific statement of the gap between what Canada promises and what Canada delivers to its Indigenous communities. The claim filed by Pikangikum First Nation in federal court sets out in legally verifiable terms what the community has experienced. No running water in any home, a water treatment plant that services only government buildings, a population that hauls water from a lake in buckets, an E. coli outbreak that resulted in a woman losing her limbs, and a chief who has been trying to get the same infrastructure problems resolved for almost 4 decades. The $2 billion damages figure is not hyperbole. It is a documented assessment of the harm caused by the gap between the government's obligations and its performance. Chief Patty Peters is 69 years old. He wants to see running water in Pikangikum before he dies. "I don't think I'll be alive in 30 years, he told the CBC. "I want to be able to see safe, clean drinking water." He has been trying to get that for 4,000 people in northwestern Ontario for most of his adult life. He has seen the water treatment plant built, underfunded, partially operated, and inadequate. He has seen his wife die without ever having running water in her home. He has filed a $2 billion lawsuit. He is still waiting. Pikangikum sits at number 1 on this list of Canadian communities with third world living conditions, not because it is the most dramatic story. The mercury poisoning of Grassy Narrows, the slop pails of Wasagamack, the 30-year boil water advisory of Neskantaga are all equally severe in their own ways. Pikangikum sits at number 1 because of what its specific situation: 4,000 people, 0 homes with running water, federal court, $2 billion, an elderly chief who has been waiting his whole career, says about the gap between the Canada that sells itself to the world and the Canada that exists for these communities. That gap is real, it is documented, and it has been documented in multiple languages by the CBC, Human Rights Watch, the government's own Auditor General, and the Federal Court of Canada. The title of this video uses the phrase third world conditions. That is not this channel's phrase. It is the phrase that community leaders, Chief Stuart Alec of Nazko, residents interviewed by Global News, and others have used to describe their own lives in their own country. They are the ones who said it. They should not have had to. If this video made you think about a part of Canada you hadn't considered before, subscribe. Drop your perspective in the comments. If you are from one of these communities and we got something wrong or missed something important, tell us. We're listening. See you in the next one.